Revelation chapter 13, and we're going to be looking at verses 11 through 14 tonight. Revelation chapter 13, verse number 11, it says, "And I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had two horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon. And he exerciseth all the power of the first beast before him, and causeth the earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. And he doeth great wonders, so that he maketh fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men, and deceiveth them that dwell on the earth by the means of those miracles which he had power to do in the sight of the beast, saying to them that dwell on the earth that they should make an image to the beast, which had the wound by a sword, and did live." And so John introduces to us this new character here. Now, the name for this man here is not really given, but in a couple of other places in the book of Revelation, he's referred to as the false prophet. He's the false prophet. And so this man is kind of the Antichrist right-hand guy, if you will. And we're going to be talking about a lot more about the things he's going to be doing. But essentially, if you want to just peg him down, he is going to be the leader of the ungodly religious system of the first half, and then continuing on in the second half, although the religious system is going to change in the second half of the tribulation to everybody worships the Antichrist. But he is going to be the one in charge of the religious systems of the tribulation. But what he does is this man will be the completion of Satan's unholy trinity. Now, and we'll talk about this even more a little bit later, but we understand that Satan is always trying to counterfeit God. He tries to counterfeit God at every step and every turn. And he's going to do so with the Trinity as well. And so you have Satan giving power to the Antichrist. You have the Antichrist ruling the globe. And then here you have the false prophet leading the world in worship of the Antichrist. And so there you have an unholy trinity with Satan, the Antichrist, and the false prophet. And so again, all of that done to undermine and counterfeit the holy trinity of God. Now, unlike the first beast, we see here that this beast comes from the earth. We see in chapter 13, verse number 1, John says, "And I stood upon the sand of the sea, and saw a beast rise up out of the sea." Well, here in verse 11, he says, "I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth." Now, people kind of speculate wildly about the identity of the Antichrist. And we talked about that a little bit a few weeks ago. But really, you don't really hear a whole lot of people speculating about the identity of the false prophet. You don't really hear that a whole lot. However, and I'm not saying this dogmatically, this is just kind of a thought. If the sea, in verse number 1, I saw a beast rising up out of the sea. If the sea of verse 1 signifies a European heritage, right? And we talked about this when we went over verse number 1. How the sea, in fact, Revelation itself defines the sea as basically the Gentile nations, okay? And so if the sea in verse number 1 is signifying a European heritage, because most people would say that this is not just any sea, but specifically the Mediterranean Sea, so therefore it's talking about a European Antichrist, so a Roman Antichrist, which fits with Daniel's prophecy. But if that's what that's talking about in verse number 1, then perhaps the earth here in verse number 11 is simply indicating that the false prophet will not be of European heritage or be somebody from outside of Europe. Now, I cannot be dogmatic about that. The fact that he comes up out of the earth is kind of a little bit of a mystery. Some people hold to the fact that the Pope's name gets thrown around a lot. A lot of people think the Antichrist is the Pope, but a lot of people also would say that he's maybe going to be the false prophet. Perhaps we can't say really with any kind of dogmatism, but we see there's a distinction made between this man and the Antichrist. Some people try to conflate the two. They're very different, and you see that in the description that John gives us here in these verses. And so the Antichrist comes from the sea; he comes from the earth. And then you see there furthermore in verse number 11, it says, "And he had two horns like a lamb." He had two horns like a lamb, and so this beast is of a different demeanor than the first beast. The first beast is described as having 7 heads and 10 horns. He's likened to a bear, a leopard, and a lion. He's ferocious. He's unwavering. He's not going to back down. He's not humble. He's overbearing. He does all these things that you would think of as these ferocious beasts. And then here you have the false prophet described as a lamb. Now he still has horns, right? And horns, and we talked about this when we went over the Antichrist, but horns in Scripture represent power. They represent power. So he still has horns, but they're just the little horns of a lamb. They're not the great 10 horns of a dragon. And so we understand that he has power. It's just lesser power. And so this power is not only lesser, but it is less obvious. He doesn't come, again, he's not coming in like a bear. He's not coming in like a leopard, like a lion. He's the lamb. And so this man, as I talked about earlier, this man will be in charge of the religious aspect of the Antichrist kingdom. I don't want to go into great detail on that because we'll talk about that later on. And as such, he will be the ultimate embodiment of Jesus' own teaching in Matthew chapter 7 when he says, "Beware of false prophets which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves." He will be not the only one who's ever fit that description, but he will be the ultimate embodiment of that particular description, somebody in sheep's clothing. That's why he describes him there as he has the horns of a lamb. He seems innocent, but he's anything but, and that's made obvious by the next phrase in verse 11. So he has 2 horns like a lamb, but look at this, but he speaks like a dragon. He looks like a lamb. He has these horns, but his words, his voice, that's the dragon. And so he may work for, and he may point people towards the Antichrist, which he does do, but his words will be Satan's words. Henry Alford, he said this, in other words, the second beast puts on a mild and lamb-like appearance, which the other did not, but it speaks as a dragon. Its words, which carry its real character, are fierce and unrelenting, while it professes that which is gentle, its behests are cruel. And I completely agree with his assessment there. Furthermore, John Walvoord says it this way: his speaking as a dragon indicates that he is motivated by the power of Satan, who is the dragon. And why do I point that out? Because we talked a lot about the words of the Antichrist, and chapter 13 does a lot to say it's going to be blasphemous. He has a blasphemous mouth. He's going to speak blasphemous words. But interestingly here, we only see that this particular beast, the second beast, the one from the earth, he's the one that has the voice of the dragon. He's the one speaking the words of the dragon. And so we can take from that, I believe that we can take from that it is clear that he operates under the same power and under the same authority as that of the Antichrist. And so he can have the same power of the first beast because he is backed by the same power. Right? The dragon is the one empowering the Antichrist. We talked about that, verse number 4 of chapter 13. And they worshiped the dragon, which gave power unto the beast. And so the dragon, which we know is Satan from chapter 12, the dragon is empowering the beast. Well, here in verse number 11, he's also given the words to the false prophet. And so we see that both of these men, both of these beasts, Antichrist, false prophet, both of these men are being backed by the same power, and that power is of Satan himself. Now his job, if you will, his description of what he's going to do is stated at the end of verse number 12. To cause the earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. And so the Antichrist, and we talked about this a couple weeks ago, the Antichrist who, in my opinion, seemingly died and resurrected. Again, I don't want to go over all that again, but I don't think he actually dies. I think he's going to pretend to have died, fake his death, and convince the world that he did die. That's my opinion on that. And so the Antichrist, who seemingly died and resurrected, is now commanding to be worshipped, and the false prophet leads the world in that worship. Again, we're going to talk about this when we get further on into the book, but there was a false religious system that's probably, if I had to guess, probably just an amalgamation of all the religions of the world today, just kind of thrown together, which is really what people kind of call for. You've probably at some point seen a bumper sticker that says coexist using all the different religious symbols. You've probably seen something like that. Ecumenicalism is a huge push right now, where let's just all come together, let's just all join, let's all hold hands, they'll claim we all worship the same God. Well, that's just patently false. But I do believe that something like that is going to be what the religious system is in the first half of the tribulation. But when the Antichrist comes in, again, seemingly dies, resurrects, they erect the statue for people to worship. At that point, they completely do away with the system of the first half, and they say, no, that's gone. Now the only option is you worship him or you die. That's what it's going to be. And this man, this false prophet, is going to lead that particular movement. He's going to be the head of all that is. Now, I like what David Guzik says here. He says, it may seem fantastic to some that the world will be led into worship of a man and of the devil. But by nature, and I absolutely agree, but by nature, men have an undeniable religious impulse, and they also have an undeniable rebellion against God. What men want most is not the elimination of religion, but their own religion. And we see this holds true really anywhere you go. You can go to any tribe, you can go anywhere in the world that they've never heard the gospel, and they are worshiping something. They religiously worship something or somebody. It's in us to worship. It's in us to give our affection to something. But, as he says, people rebel against God, so therefore the thing that they want to worship is not usually God. It's usually self. And so we may think it's odd that the world is going to fall down at the feet of this man and worship this idol, but really what they're only going to be doing is the same thing everybody else does, just a little bit more obvious. I mean, it's really just taking it just a slight step further than what everybody does when they worship any particular idol. And we'll see kind of what leads a little bit to that too. It makes it a little bit easier for the world here in verse 13. And he doeth great wonders, so that he maketh fire come down from heaven on the earth, and it says specifically in the sight of men. This is done to be seen. And so this false prophet will have signs to legitimize his religion. Now, I say it that way on purpose because I believe that, again, this is a counterfeit. This is simply another counterfeit by Satan as he copies the methodology of the apostles in the early church. Right? We talk about this. What were tongues? What were all the signs that the apostles did at the beginning of the church for? To give legitimacy to the church, to give legitimacy to the gospel, to give legitimacy to this truth that was being propagated. Now, you get into the further into the first century, those were done away with, right? People didn't need them anymore because the truth has been established, the church has been established. And so here we have the false prophet, again, part of that unholy trinity, copying the same methodology. Well, we've got signs and wonders, right? We've got signs and wonders, and so therefore there's legitimacy to our claims that you must worship this beast who, again, the world's going to think was dead and is now alive. And so it seems as if he is successful, for the world falls for this deception. And so look at verse 13 again. And he doeth great wonders, so that he maketh fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men. And verse 14, and he deceiveth them that dwell on the earth. He's successful in this. It works for him. And so Revelation chapter, hold on, let me back up. So verse 13, he talks about he doeth great wonders, plural. He's doing a lot of different things. But then he narrows in on one. He narrows in on one specific sign that this man has. So that he maketh fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men. I think that the reason he's so specific on this one, when he very clearly says he does wonders, plural, but he's specific on this one, is because, again, in my opinion, I think it's likely that this particular sign is brought out because I believe the false prophet is certainly going to use this to counteract what will be the same sign of the two witnesses. We talked about this when we were back in chapter 11. But in Revelation chapter 11, verse 5, speaking of the two witnesses, and if any man will hurt them, what happens? Fire proceedeth out of their mouth and devoureth their enemies. And if any man will be hurt them, he must in this manner be killed. And you got to understand, the two witnesses are going to be having their ministry at about the same time that all of this is happening with the false prophet. And so you have the two witnesses who are preaching the truth of God, who are doing the truth and preaching the gospel, and anybody who tries to come against them has fire devour them. Well, now you have the false prophet who's saying, well, if they can do it, I'm going to bring down fire. So now you got to decide which is right. Is it these two guys, or is it you're going to be worshiping the guy who died and is now resurrected? And so I think he's going to do this to try to counteract the signs of the witnesses. And so the false prophet will surely try to minimize the signs of the witnesses, and because to minimize their truth by performing the same sign. Now think about it from this perspective, exactly like that of Pharaoh's magicians. Right? Think back to Exodus. When we were going through Exodus, think about this. Now, they didn't do all of them, but when Aaron first starts to perform these signs, what do we see? Pharaoh's magicians do the same things. Now, they're a counterfeit, and they're not as effective, but they do them, right? Aaron throws down his rod, and it turns into a snake. They do that. And the Bible doesn't seem to illustrate to us that that was some kind of trick, that they used some kind of way to trick the mind, but it seems to tell us that when they threw their rods down, they became a snake just as Aaron's. Now we know that Aaron ate their snake, or Aaron's snake ate theirs, and so theirs was not effective. But when they turned the water to blood, now I don't know why they would want to turn more water to blood, but they do that. They get water and they also turn it to blood. They also produced frogs. Right? And so they were able to counterfeit some of the signs. Now, from that point on, they couldn't. But for a little while there, they could. They could do exactly that. Now, why? Because Pharaoh, even though he could clearly see, well, Aaron's rod ate their rod. Well, we can turn a little bit of water to blood. We can't turn it back. We can create a little bit of frogs, but we can't get rid of the frogs. He can clearly see that what they're doing does not match what God is doing, but in his mind, he can justify it and say, he did it, so can I. Right? He did it, I can do the same thing, so I must be just as right as he is. Well, that's exactly what the false prophet's going to do with these signs and try to minimize or counteract the signs of the two witnesses. And so that leads us lastly here to verse 14. And he deceiveth them that dwell on the earth by the means of those miracles which he had power to do in the sight of the beast, saying to them that dwell on the earth that they should make an image to the beast which had the wound by the sword and did live. Now, unlike the signs of the two witnesses, which point to the truth, we understand that. The signs of the false prophet are used to deceive, and he will do just that. And it seems as if, again, he is successful. The world falls for his deception, and this is exactly as Jesus said it would be. Matthew 24:24. For there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and they shall show great signs and wonders. And he goes on to say this, insomuch that if it were possible, they should deceive the very elect. He says these things are going to be so convincing that if it were possible, which thank God it's not, he said, but if it were even possible, they would be able to deceive those who are even saved and bought by Christ, but they can't do that. And so but this is how powerful his particular signs and wonders are going to be as far as they go to deceive the world. Now, another sign of the apostasy of the world at this point is seen in this idol erected. In verse number 14, it says, to the beast. And so it says that they should make an image to the beast, which had the wound by the sword and did live. Now, it doesn't tell us this, but I think that it is highly likely and probable that this particular image is what we refer to as the abomination of desolation. I think that this particular image will be what the Antichrist uses to go into the temple in Jerusalem and set up this particular image and say, you don't do what you used to do, this is what you worship now. Right? In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, it says, who opposeth and exalteth himself, speaking of the Antichrist, above all that is called God or that is worshipped, and then look at this, so that he as God sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. So I think that what this image could be is a reference to this. He's sitting in the temple of God. Look at this image in verse 14. That they should make an image to the beast which had the wound by the sword and did live. Verse 15. And we'll talk about this next week. But verse 15, and he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak, and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. And so again, we'll talk about that next week, verse 15. But we see here that this is a very impressive and miracle-inducing image, whatever this image will be. And so I think it's probably likely that that is what it was set up in the temple to be called the abomination of desolation. Now, this image, whatever form it may take, and again, we'll talk about this more later, but whatever form it may take, whether it's a statue, whether it's some kind of projection, which, I mean, you know, we can do that now, and whatever form it may take, it will become the focal point of the world's false religion. It will become the focal point. From this point forward, the worship of the beast, and as we will see later on in the passage, the taking of the mark will be inexorably linked with this image. If you worship the beast, you worship the image, and you take the mark. They're all linked together. You don't really have one without the other moving forward in Revelation. When you see worship of the beast, you see worship of the image. Where you see the taking of the mark, you see the worship of this image. And so this is a very important thing that happens that, again, we'll talk about more next week. But Revelation is clear. It makes this point very clear, that those who worship this image do escape the wrath of the Antichrist. However, by doing so, they bring upon themselves the wrath of God. And so all that they're doing is escaping a temporal wrath essentially from Satan is what this will be. But what they're doing is they're bringing upon themselves the eternal wrath of God. And that's what we'll see as we get into what this image is, and then later on into the mark of the beast that will come upon people, or that they will choose to take as they worship this particular image. And so they're scared. They're scared, they're confused, they're deceived. And many people are going to do this. Many people are going to worship this image. Many people are going to take this mark because they're afraid of this man, and they want to escape the wrath of this man. But again, by doing so, they have then sealed their eternal fate. And so next week, we will get into a little bit more detail about this particular image, and then we will get into really an introduction into the mark of the beast, what that possibly could be. As many things are said about the mark of the beast, and as many different guesses are out there as to what it is or what it will be, we don't really have that specificity in the Scripture. And so we're going to talk about what does the Scripture actually say about it, and then we'll move from there. We don't want to speculate wildly without bounding everything we do in the Scripture. So that is what we'll look at this week, and then again next week we'll get into a little bit more about this image, and we'll start talking about the mark.